We are really, really excited about today. I cannot tell you how much we are. And so we want to begin. As the land grant institution, the UCLA History Geography Project acknowledges the Tomba Gabrielino peoples as the traditional caretakers of the unceded land originally known as Tabangar, which is currently the LA basin to the Southern Channel Islands. And my hope that as one of those people that lives here, I may grow to learn how to be a better caretaker of this land, along with those Angelinos who, like me, wish to be part of the healing of our land. Happy Pride Month, everyone. I hope you are out and about enjoying a lot of the community events. We hope that there's a lot of love going around you and you're having a good time celebrating. The UCLA History Geography Project, for those of you who are new today, we are housed out of the School of Education at UCLA Center X, which is where theory and action unite. That's why we have an X. And we are also part of the California State Project for History Social Science, which means that we collaborate with folks across the state. We really do believe that collaborating with teachers, we want to make history relevant to empower young people. So we welcome you into that community, and we hope that you're here for a long, long time. Vanessa and I have been working together for almost 16 years, and yesterday Deep Alawat was here with us. She's been working with me and been partners in crime and creating lessons for a long time. So we're excited. Dan Lynch is here. So there's lots of folks that come back, and we're excited, and we're going to drag you in to help us write lessons. A little bit more about that today. These are a number of the folks that we collaborate with across the Southern California and across the state. We're very excited. Today I'll be sharing some example lessons from our Lost LA curriculum project. As you know, this is the crew. Danny today is supporting another workshop. He's going to pop in. Mark Anthony Moreno is usually here with us, helping us with logistics. He will be reaching out to you later on for those of you who will be writing lessons. Our associate director, we're really sad. Cindy Mata has left us, but she is doing incredible work at UCI at that history project. And then I am Amparo Chavez Gonzalez. I've been with UCLA since 2004, 2005. I've been an educator for 33 years now in September, and I've taught 3rd through 12th graders. And I've had the pleasure and the joy of working with a lot of teachers, coaching them throughout Southern California and Northern Cal. And I'm really, really excited to be learning with all of you today. I love these. These are like one of my favorite workshops in the summer because I get to learn a lot. So Vanessa is one of our teacher leaders. Like I said, she has incredible work that she's done. And Vanessa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Amparo. My name is Vanessa Herrera. As Amparo said, I've known Amparo for a really long time. She was one of my coaches when I first started teaching. I spent 12 years in the classroom. About 6 of that was in high school, and the other 6 was in middle school. And I taught just about everything you could think of in high school, from Latin American studies to African American studies to world to econ to government, even a law class. It was a rough semester, but we made it through. Super excited to be here with you all today.
Thank you, Vanessa. And this is a workshop that is in collaboration with the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies, the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, and the UCLA Latin American Institute. And I cannot tell you how excited we are. We know we have some of our partners here today. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves quickly.
Hi, my name is Joanna, and I am the program manager at the Center for Near Eastern Studies, and we are part of the group from the International Institute that is helping host this. And thank you guys for coming.
All right, those of you who are going to be, who would like extension credits for this course, if you did not sign up yesterday, please make sure you sign up for it today. This is the course number that you want to sign up for. It's really important that you know that you can get those extension credits. I know when I was teaching, those extension credits help you move along that pay scale and also fulfill other requirements for districts. And here's the agenda. This is what it looks like. We will be adding resources, so bookmark that somewhere for yourself. We'll add resources as we go along throughout our days. I also want to really ask you to please do our evaluations. Again, those help us document the work that we do, and then the sign-in is there. And we will put that in the chat one more time for you. All right, so we want to remind you that this is part of our connection to the framework. And when we think about, how do we think about teaching 10th grade world history, our framework talks about thinking about and shifting the way that we think about this period of time in history by thinking about what content we teach, what kind of literacy students are practicing and developing. And I know some of you heard 7th graders scores have dropped. If you ask me, you need to use more history, social science, literacy techniques and skills to increase literacy and reading. And for me, the way we do it is by making things local and connected to students' lives and to events that are happening. So today, that's one of the biggest reasons why I'm excited about this workshop, right? In that 10th grade framework, two of the areas that we are asking folks to really think about to shift is to think about democracy and power relations. And the way that we do it in the History Geography Project is to think about inquiry, asking questions rather than lecture, and bookwork, but getting young people to become historians and do what historians do. And then obviously this idea of democracy connects to the ideas of citizenship and what it means to be a member of the world, your community, your family, your school. So for today, these are our driving questions. I'll leave them up for a couple of seconds if you haven't connected already to the agenda and have that PowerPoint. All right. I'm going to do some logistics, some kind of not so exciting stuff, but what I want to make sure everybody knows is that those of you, it's optional, but those of you who would like to write a lesson, you will receive a stipend for writing the lesson. Great, now I'm coughing. Of $250. These are requirements for that lesson plan. One, that it be original material, that it's one of the topics from the Themes in World Democracy, the World History, Democracy, and Power workshop, that you have 2 to 3 sources, that you have a step-by-step lesson plan, that there's an assessment that is attached to it, obviously that it's aligned to Common Core and the history content standards, that you look to align it to the themes of democracy and power. If you're enrolling in this for extension, the lesson plan really is not optional. However, since you're getting the stipend, it helps pay for your the course. We also want to make sure that there are accurate citations, sources, and bibliography. And we want you to know that it will be published on the UCLA History Geography Project website, as well as International Institute. And what I've done, and if Vanessa or someone can please, there are 2 examples that I've hyperlinked here for you. They are both from our Lost LA curriculum. I'm just quickly gonna talk about these You can also look at those examples. You can have those examples to refer to later. Obviously, your lesson needs to have a inquiry, right? And there's some logistics there about fonts and things like that. If you're writing a lesson, for example, for ethnic studies, please let us know the connection to ethnic studies principles, for example, if you want to use it for that. One of the other things that is really important is that you list your sources, right? We need to make sure that sources are listed accurately and correctly so that teachers can find them later. If you have hyperlinks, that's wonderful. Teachers love, those hyperlinks. Most importantly, it needs to be original material, right? There are folks that we find sources for lessons, and then we need to look for the original image or source. It's important for copyright issues. And sad to say, we have had situations where folks borrowed materials from other lessons or other people, and then we had to unfortunately either not use those sources or that material, or we could not use the lesson altogether because there was too much that was taken from other places and it was a copyright infringement. So please, 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 you need to be cognizant of that. We also have an overview of the lesson that we let teachers know what is going on. And then the other part that I think as teachers is the hardest part is those step-by-step procedures, right? What should teachers do first, second, third? Amanda Tanaka was really good about even including images from when her students tried out the lesson. So you can take a look at hers about the Dodgers. And then making sure that we have primary sources with citations, right? This is an example from the leisure communities and Nick Gabaldon. Lastly, we want to make sure that students have handouts or graphic organizers, that those are also included. You see the teacher who did the lesson on beach communities, they love to, he loves putting everything on a QR code. So that's how he has kids access handouts. We want to make sure that if you're having students do a summit, that when you have students do a summative assessment for this lesson, if there's a rubric that you included, if there are handouts to be filled out or things that students need to do, that assessment and handouts for that are clear. And you can see how these two teachers documented that. And so now I want to see if there are any questions regarding the lesson, and that I open up for folks to have maybe a couple, 2 or 3 questions if we have them. Do I see
Amparo,
some?
we have a question in the chat of, does the lesson have to be for world history? And when does a lesson need to be submitted by?
That's a great question. I will find out about the deadline, unless Joanna or Cleo know it. It won't be like next week, so don't fret. I will make sure we clarify that with Danny and.
Yeah, I don't know. I think last time we gave them at least about a month or so.
Yeah, that's what I remember. And also too, we'll set up times where there can be some times for you to meet probably with Vanessa and myself if you have questions or you want some feedback. And we will give you feedback before you turn in the final lesson, just so you know. Okay. So it is about a month's time, 4 to 5 weeks. And what was the second question, Vanessa? Yes, me olvidó.
The second question was asking if it needed to be world history.
Oh, does it have to be for 10th grade? No, if there's another age group, but it does need to use the materials from this series and be connected to democracy and power. So if you are a 7th grade teacher and you want to go for it, yeah, we're always excited.
And then Amparo, one final question. Is the template suggested or as a reference, or is the template needed to be used?
You will be using the template that we've created for this institute, and I will be putting it into your resources later. It has to be it has to be this format. That's the format that we use. You guys can send me an email. You can send me some questions in the chat on when we go on breaks or when you're in breakout rooms, and I will read them since I'm sharing my screen. And today I don't have two screens. Any others?
One last question. Isn't there another class in August? I'm not sure, from Darcy White. It just says, is there another class in August?
Is there another part of this series in August? Not from this series.
Okay, I'm just speaking up for a second. I looked at the class and it had another August date.
Oh,
So in addition to
you mean the extension?
yeah.
Okay. That would probably be a meetup session or a coaching session. So again, I will find out, right?
Thank
To
you.
like make sure, it might end up being like a reflective survey as well. So yeah,
Okay.
we'll
Thanks.
make sure we let you know about that as well. Thank you. Are we good?
And then one final, can we focus on one of the lessons from this week?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You can borrow materials that we shared with you. You can absolutely, this is exactly why we're having the institute. And full disclosure, we don't have a lot of lessons that have been created about the time period that we're looking at today, from what happened in Northern Africa and with the uprisings. Please, please, we want lessons. We need those, and we would be so excited for those of you who write lessons for that, because we think it's very much needed. And later on, we'll talk about connections that Vanessa is going to walk us through, and thinking about connections to our students here and our lives as well. So please, if today gets you geeky happy, like it's gonna, I know it's gonna get me from having a preview, then please write a lesson, because we are so excited to be learning. And with that note, I want to pass it over to my colleague Vanessa, and she'll be telling me when I need to move along.
Thank you. And Amparo, there were a few last things that came in at the very end there. And just to let folks know, yes, you will have access to the slides. And yes, you will have access to the lessons once they've been vetted and submitted and published by UCLA.
Yeah, they go published on our website. So everybody gets to benefit from your incredible work as usual, and it's free for other teachers to take a look and peek.
And thank you so much, folks, for coming back this morning. I am super excited about today. And I was having a conversation with Amparo and with Danny about how all the different ways that the Arab Spring is very unique. And one of the ways that it is super unique is that we all watch this happen in real time, minute by minute, tweet by tweet, Facebook post by Facebook post. Everyone on this call lived through this, even if you weren't in North Africa, even if you don't have a personal connection to the Middle East. We saw this happening on the news across our social media feeds. And so that makes this revolution, this uprising, incredibly different from what we saw yesterday. When we look at the Mexican Revolution, right, we were talking about a time period of decades. She's talking about the Mexican Revolution. The professor was saying we can look at that in two different 10-year periods. And here with the Arab Spring, we're looking at it in minutes, minute by minute. And this particular revolution doesn't have the luxury, like we're looking at this midway and hasn't had the luxury of kind of time and space in that way. 1 year out, 2 years out, 10 years out, folks are writing, publishing, doing retrospectives, giving coverage on what is happening now. And so that really makes this pretty different it makes it feel very different when we are looking at this. We're looking at very recent history and things that people are still living, not only in these places, but also in our classrooms, because we do need to remember that we do have North Africans, we do have folks from the Middle East, students from the Middle East sitting in our classrooms, and some who have been displaced and are in our classrooms because of these things that have happened in this part of the world. And so we're going to start with some quick breakout rooms. And I want you to put yourself in the little time machine that we put our students in and think back to late 2010s, the late 2010, early 2011. And what do you personally remember about this news coverage? What do you personally remember about this time period and what you were seeing and possibly what you were feeling or connections that you might have had? We're going to put folks into breakout rooms, introduce yourselves, give a good morning to whoever you're there with. You'll be in pairs, so there'll be 2 of you there. And if you can please address these questions of what you remember about late, December of 2010 and that early part and that whole year of 2011 in relation to this. Welcome back, folks. I hope that you had some rich conversations of remembering where you were and what your thoughts were about the coverage and what we were seeing in late 2010 and early 2011. One of the things that we're hoping to have people think about this morning is really how we make sense of revolution, of uprisings as they're happening, and how we make sense of it now, how the people on the ground and in these countries are connected to these countries, we're making sense of it at the time. Amparo, if you can go ahead and move the slide forward. Just to ground us in some geography and to remember how widespread these uprisings and revolutions really were, and how many different countries were really affected and involved in this in one way or another. And I know the professor is going to go into more detail about different places and kind of what was happening there. Go ahead and move the slide forward, Amparo. Good, thank you. And so we've got a quick video. It's about 4 minutes long. And these are different youth activists from a few different countries talking about how they were making sense of things at the time. So this video is from late 2011. So they're talking about what is very recent history to them at the time of, and that is kind of, we'll take a look here and listen to how they are making sense of what they are seeing and what they're participating in around them. Go ahead, Amparo.
There were people in those protests that I would have never even dreamed of seeing in a protest. People who lived, you had everyone from people who drove convertible BMWs and worked in banks to people who drove pickup trucks and worked on planting, vegetables and so on. Everyone from Bahrain was there. And as I was saying, the role of women, 50% of almost all the protests were women. And I think one of the most amazing scenes that I've seen on video caught from Bahrain is a woman, wearing the traditional abaya and the traditional hijab, which here in the West is usually seen as a sign of oppression and so on, going out and writing on the wall. I remember she was writing graffiti and it said when she was done, even if the men decide to give up, the woman will continue with the revolution. And for me, that was one of the most inspiring things.
اللي حاصل إنه في الثورة لأنها ثورة شباب تجمعت آمالنا وتجمعت مطالبنا كانت نوعا ما متشابهة فصرنا صرنا واعيين نحن إيش بنحتاج.
All the days that we have spent in Tahrir Square were full of experiences that reinforce the meanings of freedom and dignity and the value of human rights and fighting for it.
J'ai été recherché depuis quelques années parce qu'il y a d'autres qui ont été arrêtés, qui m'ont signalé, qui recherchaient à récolter des informations sur mon pseudo. Je me suis fait kidnapper le 6 janvier à 6h du matin. On a sonné à la porte, j'ai regardé par la fenêtre et là il y avait une foule d'hommes en civil et je savais pertinemment que c'était la police politique en Tunisie. Et je me battais aussi pour ces gens-là, pour les enfants de ces gens-là. Et donc je me suis dit, bon, advienne qui pourra, je vais aller affronter mon destin et peut-être que j'arriverai à les convaincre aussi. Mais...
The social media played a key role. They were an alternative public sphere for the youth who were unable to express their opinions freely because the environment was controlled.
Imagine every time I write about the violations taking place in Bahrain, around 28,000 people around the world read what's going on. And because specifically in places like Bahrain, it's not being covered, this is one of the most important ways to get the information out.
نحن كشعب يمني السوشيال ميديا ما كانتش قوية في البداية، لكن اللي برضو نحن لعبناه في الميدان إنه عملنا توعية بطريقة استخدام السوشيال ميديا، وإنه يعني كيف ممكن نوصل فكرتنا عن طريق الإنترنت. فاللي حاصل إنه سرعة شديدة، يعني نقدر نوصل فكرتنا وببساطة شديدة وبسرعة فائقة ولأكبر قدر من الناس عن طريق الإنترنت.
Human rights activist isn't someone, who has earned the reputation within the international community and is recognized by everyone. That's not who a human rights activist is. I think today, every single person on those streets who is going out and risking everything by saying, I am worth more, I know my rights and I'm willing to fight for them, those are all human rights activists.
Thank you so much, Amparo. And if folks wouldn't mind just dropping into the chat your thoughts on how folks at the time were making sense based on what we're seeing here. How are these young activists making sense of what they were seeing and what they were participating in around them? So thoughts on what these youth activists and how they were making sense of things around them in 2011. So I'm hearing people pulling out the quote, I'm worth more. That caught my eye as well. People talking about how one person can make a difference. Comments on how young folks were, the fearlessness that people were expressing. This clear communication through social media. Comments on how this is not a Western lens that folks are looking through, the role of women. Pulling out the quote from the woman from Bahrain about how the women would keep protesting, this feeling of optimism, this feeling of hopefulness and idealism. Thank you so much for sharing here. Yes. So as I was mentioning, right, one of the things that feels so unique about this particular uprising is that folks are making sense of it at that time. Folks have been trying to make sense of it 13 years later and throughout that whole time. More things here about women, about censorship, about social media. Thank you. Amparo, if you can go ahead and move the slides forward. And then one more time so we can see and one more, there we go, thank you. So now 13 years later, the question changes a little bit into who is trying to make sense of this now? What are voices today saying about what it was that happened these 13 years ago, or what started happening these 13 years ago? Because in the scholarship that I'm reading, it all feels very unfinished, right? Especially if we're comparing it to the Mexican Revolution, right? We're talking about 20 years of change. And here we're looking at 13 years after the start of this. So we're looking at how people are trying to make sense of this here, both in the Middle East and North Africa, and in other places of the world. So what I'm going to have folks do, I'm going to drop a link in the chat. If I can find the link, I will drop the link in the chat, and we're going to go ahead and have folks explore this link. We've got a series of different quotes of how people are reflecting, how this particular group of professors is reflecting 10 years later, how they are trying to make sense of this. Oh, that is not the link. We'll try again. There's the link. And so folks, feel free to go ahead and turn off your cameras. We're going to give you about 8 minutes to explore that link, to explore some of the different quotes and perspectives and different ways that folks are trying to make sense of what happened 13 years ago.
And I will be playing some music. And when you hear the music start to fade, you know it's time to come back. We'll also have a timer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amparo, for the music. And thank you so much, folks, for taking the time to look through those things. We've got just a few minutes to kind of debrief this, and then we'll hand it over to have the professor be introduced. Wanted to give folks an opportunity to share their reflections in terms of how people were making sense of this at the time, how people are making sense of this today, or anything that folks would like to share about their own personal memories, or rememberings of their own personal rememberings of 13 years ago. I'm hearing only Tunisia, where the Arab Spring started, is on the path for democracy. Most of the countries are under autocratic rule. But the autocrats are not the same. When you put things into larger context of the world's history from the Arab Spring leading to today, we read Elizabeth Thompson's quote, "The 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring brings to mind the general decline of democracy around the world." I find it interesting that foreign powers always interfere where they're not wanted. My sense has been one of disappointment, but that of the potential was not fully realized in the case of Syria and Yemen in particular. Life has become grim. Reminds me of failures, again, of the French Revolution, and the Western influences always seem to dirty the waters, colonialism, imperialism. Opinions are mixed on the legacy of the Arab Spring. We also emphasize the connection between internet technologies and government questions. Yeah. When I put my teacher hat on, I see some really interesting connections and possible lessons between use of media in like the American Revolution and use of media in the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring must not be understood in terms of late discovery of democracy by non-Western people. Rather, it appears to be the latest battle in the long war for freedom, equality, and dignity waged by ordinary people, end quote. We need to honor the history of the struggle too. Nanette Levison's quote was very powerful. Reminds me of the Tiananmen Square protests in the 1980s. Mirage, it's haunting. Reflections are somewhat depressing, emphasizing on the shift back to autocrats with the exception of Tunisia. It reminds me of a question I got from one of my astute 10th grade students when we were learning about autocracy versus democracy. Why is it that the Middle East, Africa, and Latin American countries have more autocratic rulers than the West? We've got some really good thoughts here. I can tell that folks are really thinking deeply about what these young people were saying, the things that we're reading, and our own personal connections, whether they are personal connections to that part of the world or just being world citizens and hearing and having a very live memory of these things. It reminds me of a quote of Paulo Freire: "It takes time and history to make history." This is still happening. 10 years is a blip. History is in the making. In some ways, this parallels how social media is seen today. At first, it was new and exciting and powerful in a good way. Now it is something that looked as harmful to certain groups of people. economic stability of the development and fostering of democracy by world power stood out to me. Thank you so much, folks, for really thinking deeply here. I appreciate it. And then with that, I will hand this over to Cleo, who will introduce Dr. Mohammed.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cleo Sawihi. I am the Program Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Near Eastern Studies. It's a pleasure to be here and a great pleasure to have you join us today. I am so thrilled to introduce to you Dr. Mohammed Al-Da'dawi, Professor and Chair of Political Science, History, and Philosophy at Oklahoma City University. Dr. Da'dawi specializes in political Islam, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, democratization, and authoritarianism in the MENA region. He has written for top publications and appeared as a commentator on media outlets such as C-SPAN, Al Jazeera English, the BBC, and many more. He's also an author whose books include The Historical Dictionary of the Arab Uprisings. Please help me welcome Mr. Mohammed Al-Da'dawi.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I hope that everybody can hear me. Okay, good. And I'm really pleased. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks everyone for making this very event very possible. Today we'll be discussing, of course, a topic that is still, I would say, in the news, a topic that is important, of course, for a lot of people, millions of people, especially in the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region. And it's a topic, of course, that is ongoing. I think you're all having a very good discussion as that I've been reading the chats, and I love all of the comments and the commentary, of course, and all of the dynamics, leading to the Arab Uprising, Arab Springs, and you're all, personal, I would say, experience, from 2011, 2012, and what was going on at that time. The Arab Uprising, as you know, and I want to share my screen here, I think. Let me know if you can't see it. You can see it now? Okay. One thing that we always tend to do, and especially when we talk about the uprising, we try to at least look at the region, right? I mean, this is what we study in the Middle Eastern studies. And a lot of times when we say Middle Eastern studies, we sometimes focus on the Middle East proper, kind of from Iraq, Iran, I would say, to the west, and then, of course, to the east, and, of course, Egypt to the west. And we stop at that. And we tend to forget a little bit about North Africa. And I love that, of course, the Arab Uprising, one of the many positives, of course, that it brought about to the region, also to the academic study of the Middle East and North Africa, is that it put North Africa on the map. For us, for example, scholars that do a lot of work on North Africa, what is called sometimes the Maghreb. I don't know if you've heard about the word Maghreb or Maghreb. The Maghreb includes Morocco, Mauritania, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And sometimes it tends to be neglected in the study. So because of the Arab Uprisings, or because of the importance of Tunisia to it, right? Of course, the catalyst to the Arab Uprisings or Arab Springs at that time. And later on, I'll talk a little bit why we call it uprisings and we don't call it anymore spring and so on, right? But the catalyst for the Arab Spring was in Tunisia. It really recentered that focus of the Middle Eastern studies, of course, on North Africa. So what are we talking? You've been talking a lot about Arab Spring, Arab Uprisings, and so on, right? These are a series of protests, mass protests by people in the Middle East and North Africa against certain things that they didn't like about their own government. These are populations that were inspired by a great deal of ideas that commonly we would call liberal democratic ideas, but also because of their hope for a better economic future for their own areas as well, for own region. And one thing, I don't know if you've been talking about it this morning or not, one thing that these regions have all in common is that it is a sea of authoritarianism. These are all, in a sense, autocratic regimes. And I'm talking about 2010, 2011, up to the pivotal events of the Arab uprising. If you look at this map, for example, from Morocco all the way to Iran, Iran is missing here. They seem to stop here in Iraq, but we do include Iran, and we do also include Turkey in the Middle East. But this is again where the Arab Spring happened, and we didn't have it really in Iran or Turkey. If you look at all of these countries, with the exception, let's say, of Israel, with the exception of Israel, all of the countries are authoritarian countries. Israel is considered to be an electoral, democracy. Now, of course, there is some blemishes, of course, on the democracy, but that is beyond the scope of this conversation. But it is an autocratic, seat. Now, there are what we call republican systems, authoritarian systems, and there are what we call monarchical systems as well. So, for example, in the Gulf, you have Saudi Arabia, you have, Oman, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, all monarchical systems. And of course, the other non-Gulf states are Jordan and Morocco. I'm originally from Morocco, so I do a little bit of research on Morocco as well, and we'll be talking about it in here as well. And later we'll discuss that there is also a variation on the consequences for the Arab Spring, because it seems that the Republican systems did not fare as well, let's say, than the monarchical system. So there is a whole regime type argument that, the Republican systems didn't do too well, and that's where you have most of the upheavals. And then monarchical systems seem to weather the tempest of the Arab uprisings and why that is and so on. So we can talk about that a little bit. Now, I usually put a lot of graphs in my classes because I think that's probably more visual, and I think it would help you as well when you are also teaching these courses, just to look at, for example, where this is happening, who is taking part in these as well. So I have here something from the Arab Barometer that was done in 2013, which is, of course, basically a survey mechanism that is out of, Princeton, led by Amani Jamal. And they looked and they surveyed the people that actually went into this protest in two key states early on in the Arab Spring, and that is Tunisia, of course, and Egypt. And they looked at the percentage of participation in protests, because when we talk about this protest, not any protest or every protest or all protests are created equal. Some protests, can be small in number, they're inconsequential for the government. But if there are mass protests, massively, of course, mobilized and so on protests, they can cause problems, and they've caused issues, of course, for these states. So here it provides you a snapshot of percentages of people that went in the street. So, for example, in Egypt, you have 8%. We'll say, well, 8% is not a lot. That is 8% of about 94 million people that was the population of Egypt in 2011, 2012, if I believe. Now it's about 109 million, right? So 8%, that's a huge, massive number of people that went in the streets of different cities in Egypt. That's not just the Tahrir Square in Cairo. And of course, if you look at 16 in Tunisia, it's a larger percentage, but of course the population in Tunisia is about 10 million, so a smaller population, but 16% of the people went into the streets, of course, and boulevard, of course, of Tunis and Tunisia in order to actually protest certain things that we're going to be talking about in a little bit. So why these people are protesting the way they were. Now, in terms of gender, we also looked at this predominantly male, right? So gender participation in the protests were pretty much equal. 77% in Egypt is male, 79% in Tunisia. That doesn't mean that women did not have any role. That's wrong. Women had a very important role, and I think a lot of it happened in terms of organization, mobilization, dissemination of information and pamphlets and so on. Some of the most important, I would say, and pivotal activists were actually women. I'm closer to the Tunisian example. For example, I have several friends that were bloggers at that time that were leading the charge in Tunisia for the protest. There was a question for you as well, that what were you in a sense doing in a sense 2010, 2011 when the protest happened. I was basically at home, and actually at that time I was teaching a class on modern Middle Eastern politics, and then I get all these texts from female blogger, Lina Ben Henni. She has passed since then. Unfortunately, may she rest in peace. But she, of natural causes, by the way, because in autocratic regimes, we usually don't, we have to always qualify it. And she starts to say, hey, have you seen what's going on in Tunisia? There's something going on in Tunisia. Somebody, self-immolated. That was Mohammed Bouazizi. I don't know if you've talked about him. You've seen him, and of course, in the literature that I sent you. Are you following, right? Because at that time I had a blog and about Morocco and about the North Africa, so they wanted a little bit of support for what was going on in terms of the protests early on, right? In Sidi Bouzid, of course, which is this town in the outskirts of Tunis, of course, that led the charge early on when it comes to the protest. Age distribution, we have similar kind of discussion when we talk about, and this is something that you probably were exposed to it, about the youth bulge in the Middle East and North Africa. One of the main catalysts why we had protested, because you have this anxiety and anxious youth that were demanding certain things, political and economic, of course, right? But when we look at the protests, right, we found that there is a little bit, it's not only just the youth, because we had a little bit of variation, especially when it comes to Egypt. We have 59% of the protesters that were between 25 and 44 years old. I'm 45 years old, so I don't think of myself as a youthful anymore. So I'm saying that I'm not qualifying that as youth. But the argument that we had early on, before we did the surveys and whatnot, and we know now, of course, a lot about that, is that this is largely 18 to 20 somethings that were leading and they were going in the process, and that is not true. In Tunisia, only 35% are under 24 years old, right? So it was, again, a wider scope in terms of age that went into the streets. Now, why it happened, right? Of course, there's a lot of reasons. And again, of course, we always like to back it with data, and of course, asking people that went in the streets. So why, Barometer, why are you in the streets? What are you protesting, and so on? And I go back to James Carville, the political kind of democratic, strategist from a few years ago, during the Clinton administration, I think during the campaigns, and kind of like the reset. And the understanding here is that if you want to be elected, you have to look at the economy. So he coined that term. It's the economy stupid. Economy is the most important thing that motivates people to vote, or to, in this case, go in the streets. And that's why I'm plagiarizing or quoting. I'm putting it between quotes. James Carville says it's the economy stupid. So if we look at Tunisia and Egypt, I would say a plurality of the voters, not the majority, but the plurality. There's other reasons as well. In Egypt, 38% says the economy. And then Tunisia says 32% say the economy. Then after that, you say it is corruption, of course, which is endemic in the Middle East and North Africa. It's one of those, if you look at Transparency International, which is a very good source for people. It's a nonprofit organization that put these listings of all countries in the world in terms of the perception of corruption. And you find that the Middle East and North Africa is always in the bottom of those countries. And then, of course, the economy, then they said, is the qualified, is also civic political freedoms, right? Opposition to Gamal Mubarak in Egypt, because the argument here is that in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, who was the president at that time, was grooming his son, Gamal Mubarak, to take over. And in a sense, a la Syrian example, because in Syria, they had this, after the death of Hafid al-Assad, who was the president of Syria at that time, autocratic regime as well. And he basically bequeathed, of course, this republic to his son, the current president, Bashar al-Assad. To the point that, of course, the Middle Eastern political systems, in a sense, invented a new category of governments, which is called hereditary republicanism, in a sense, right? So some in Egypt went in the streets because they did not like that. They did not want to follow suit, in Syria, and have this hereditary form of republicanism and so on. And some also argued that there are also demands for civil and political freedoms, and which again was a general theme that permeated throughout, right? I mean, if you ask people, and I was in Morocco at that time, right after that time, because it was a semester, but then that summer I went in Morocco and in what was called the February 20th movement in Morocco, which is the name that was given to the protest movement in Morocco, that you ask them, and a lot of the similar themes, right? The economy is not doing well. There's a high unemployment rate. There is also a great deal of corruption, nepotism, what we call the wasta in the Middle East and North Africa. So basically, the process, informal, corrupt, nepotistic process by which you get jobs, you get all sorts of favors and so on by those that are in the government. And of course, civil and political freedoms. One thing that is missing here, and that is something that, of course, bears mentioning, is the Islamist view, right? And it's not. Neither in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, any of these countries, the Islamists came later on. Islamists, I refer to all the groups, not just the radical ones, but also the peaceful ones, the peaceful Islamist political parties in the Middle East, and they exist in North Africa as well. They came later to these protests. Actually, initially in some of these countries, they did not go into the streets. They wanted to wait and see, right, how the government interacts and how it responds and reacts to these protests. So, but if you ask anybody in the Middle East at that time about the reasons for the protests, it's economic and political. Of course, the corruption, the venality, of course, of the systems and so on. If you look at that, just to buttress what we're saying or what the protesters are saying in the surveys, I looked at some of the data from Freedom House, from that time. So this is a snapshot from the 2011, 2012, and so on. And you look at this, so this is not, accurate today. I would say still more accurate than not, right? And we'll talk about that. I know that some of you are arguing that, Tunisia is probably on the path of democracy. Unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, not anymore. And I'll tell you later on why. It's part of this lecture. So in a sense, it hasn't changed that much, right? But this is the snapshot. If it's a purple color in Freedom House, it means that they are not free countries. They categorize as not free. So these are basically the dictatorial, autocratic regimes. Yellow, it's the semi-free, partly free, right? Still autocratic, authoritarian regimes. They have certain measures of democratic norms, but they're not entrenched enough in the system so that the system itself or the government is fully democratic. And the only one, of course, is Israel, according to Freedom House. The lack of freedom continues, of course, even when we talk, of course, about the press freedom, which is very important measure as a fourth estate as well in democratic governance, right? And you see that purple all over the place, which means that the press is completely not free. Even in some of those countries that are partly free, generally speaking, in terms of that continuum that Freedom House has, when it comes to press freedom, it's the same story for everybody, with the exception, of course, of Israel slightly, of course, and again. This has not changed even today. So this is from 2013, but even today, if you look at the press is still not free in these countries. In terms of the protest and how they are diffused, right? And this is something, of course, that I think some of you have accurately depicted, right? A lot of it happened through the social media, and this is something that we talked about. I mean, some of the researchers and the scholars have that you have with the Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings, initially Arab Springs, this new phenomenon of new leadership movements. So I call leaderless movements. So if you have to point, who's the leader of the protest in Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, Yemen, whatever, there's not a single person, right? So this is a leaderless mass mobilization that happened, of course, primarily through technology, through social media, through Twitter, Facebook, YouTube at that time, and so on, right? And it was very key initially in helping a lot of these protesters get their message out, because there's a lot of learning that happened between these countries. That's what made it more dangerous for these regimes, and they call it the tsunami of the Arab uprising, the Arab Spring, right? Because it could not contain it in one state, because because of technology, because of the use of social media, the Moroccans learned from the Tunisians, the Egyptians learned from the Tunisians, Algerians learned from the Tunisians and the Algerians and so on, and the Egyptians as well, right? But the Tunisian example was probably the most important one, right? Because they were the first in terms of mobilization. So social media was used as not only as for mobilization, as I say here, but to frame those anti-state grievances. They wanted to do certain things so that they can actually garner tremendous help from or sympathy from their own population as well, right? Because you want to get people in the streets. So they framed it not in those terms that are divisive. Let's say you're in Tunisia, it's more of a secular state, but they have a very important and powerful Islamist, presence with Hizb al-Nahda, or the party of the Nahda, the Renaissance, party. So they stayed away from that. So in terms of framing, they framed it as secular anti-state grievances in terms of civil, political rights and so on and so forth that are, not to them at that time corrupted by any other religious, in a sense, impulse, right? So that was important initially, and that's something that the Egyptians use as well, the Moroccans used as well, the Yemenis as well to a lesser extent. What's important about social media, as I said, because it doesn't cost much. Right, everybody has a cell phone. You have a smartphone. You have access to these. You have internet. You have data. And even with initial, when the Egyptians, especially in the case of Egyptians, when they went dark, right, when they basically turned off the internet on the whole country, a lot of the engineers within Egyptian example, of course, found third-party ways, of course, VPNs. They found very clever ways by which they can actually help with the circumvent, if you want, the Egyptian, internet blackout. And then, of course, what happened with social media, everybody can take part in it, right? And that's what I call democratization of the public sphere, right? So this is the idea that, I can be using my cell phone, somebody who's, a lawyer can use it as well, somebody who's a student can use it, everybody has access to the same means, of course, and can participate, and in a sense, feel part of the protests, okay? And that was very foundational, very, helpful for the media. And here you look at, for the protesters, here you look at the usage in the Egyptian and Tunisian, uprising, when it comes to social media, the mentions, of course, of some of these key reasons here. I'm trying to get rid of one page, screen here, but it's not important. And it looks initially, of course, at how the frequency of the use of Twitter and some of the hashtags, and that was of course with the Egypt is in blue, Tunisia is in orange, right? And then, of course, you see that when it peaked, of course, it peaked around those pivotal times in the timeline of the Tunisian and Egyptian protest. One of them, of course, when right before Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali, who was the president of Tunisia at that time, resigned. And then, of course, at the time when it peaked, when there was a constitutional referendum, when it passed in Egypt, right? In ushering in, of course, the end of not the regime, because the regime is the political order, but the political system of the leadership, of course, of Hosni Mubarak, right? And we'll come back, of course, to that these are initially, those were seen as areas of success. Unfortunately, later on, of course, it turned out to be more of the same. Any questions so far? Because I don't want to just talk the whole time, because I want to make sure that I'm not just leaving anybody behind, right? Because I'm trying to look at the chat as well and see. Okay, so and that was a good segue, of course, because we want to talk about Tunisia and what happened. And then in Tunisia, of course, unfortunately, a lot of people did not know about Tunisia outside the Middle East and North Africa until the Arab uprising. Until the Arab uprising, Tunisia was probably a footnote for a lot of the scholars, right? And that was a mistake because, of course, later on, when we scrambled to know about Tunisia, we found a lot of scholarship, not in English, but it was done a lot in French, right? So it was an advantage to some, but a disadvantage to other, right? But Tunisia is one of the most progressive states in the Middle East, in the Arab, I would say. And of course, I'm saying Arab, and I'm very hesitant here because we know that the Middle East and North Africa is very diverse. So when I say Arab, I'm just saying in terms of the majority of the population itself. I'm not trying to negate that there is Amazigh, what what some would call Berber, but don't call them Berber because they don't like that. That's considered to be pejorative. So they call them Amazigh population, right? And there's also all sorts of other identities and populations and nations as well, and religions. It's very colorful, very diverse, area, of the world. Tunisia, like most, somebody talked about colonialism and imperialism. Most of the Middle East and North Africa was under some colonial power. And Tunisia, of course, was under the French influence, like Morocco, like Algeria, and most of Western Africa, until 1956, when they received their own independence, right? From the beginnings, of course, of the independence itself, right? There was a dominance of one party system linked to a charismatic leader at that time. And that's what happens with charismatic leaders. Of course, they tend to dominate the political system and surround, if you want, that political system around them with, one political party to institutionalize it and to give a semblance that it was legitimate institutionally speaking, right? And that leader, just for the name, Habib Bourguiba, right, who was considered to be the father of the modern Tunisian state. He was the one who was one of the leaders for the independence and so on and so forth. Later on, of course, he would turn the whole country into an autocratic fiefdom for him, right? So from 1959 until, of course, 1989, we have one ruler, and then, of course, his protege that, in a sense, led a bloodless palace coup against him, removed him from office, and that was Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali, who was removed by the Arab uprising, by the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia. They had a overture or a semblance of an overture to multi-partyism in 1980, but it was sham. It was not really. It was just to add a little bit of legitimacy because there was more pressure from the population at that time for a little bit openness, political openness, from some European countries as well, and so on, to open up. So they allowed for multi-party systems that basically consolidated the rule of the one-party system that they had. And then in 1987, Bourguiba, and by 1989, Ben Ali would be in power. Bourguiba was replaced by Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali, the president of Tunisia until 2011 in a palace coup. He was Western aligned, like a lot of these political systems that we study in the Middle East and North Africa, with the exceptions, of course, Iran and so on. He really, and of course, because of the size of Tunisia, economically speaking, is not really that diverse, relies on tourism, agriculture. It relies heavily on especially European Union markets. So you had no choice, of course, by espousing this Western aligned kind of ideologies, opening up the market, Tunisian market, of course, for investments from European countries and so on, espousing a liberal economic agenda that only benefited his own entourage and own family, right? Lacking basic freedoms, of course, political freedoms like the right to vote, freedom of speech, and so on and so forth. And that was, again, what would doom the regime later on, right? Because when the protesters went in the streets, they said, yeah, well, according to all these economic indices, Tunisia should be doing well. But that wealth is not trickling down. So what we call it is predatory capitalism. So yes, it's a liberal economy, it's capitalism, but it's only benefiting his family, literally his family. I mean, his wife, his son-in-law, his daughter, and so on and so forth. There's rampant corruption. The family and the president, they were doing well, of course, economically speaking, but the rest of the population, right, you suffering from high inflation, high unemployment, and so on. And you add to that, of course, lack of basic freedoms, right? So there was tremendous, repression by the Tunisian state. They were notorious for that amount of violence against, dissidents and opposition forces and so on. And again, that would be somewhat fed, that tumult and anxiety, of course, with the Tunisian when they went to the streets. But the catalyst for it, I would say, right, was this, and I think this is the catalyst for the whole Arab Spring, right, was this self-immolation by Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor who was deprived of what he perceived his dignity and basic right, of course, to help his family. I mean, you have no prospect for employment, you have no you have bleak future and so on, and then the state is also repressing you. So what happened? He was selling his vegetables and so on and so forth, and then a policewoman came to him and said, "Hey, you have to get your stuff out of here," right? And then he didn't like that. He said, "No, I want to sell," and so on and so forth. There was some exchange in words and whatnot, and actually slapped him. And in the Middle East, of course, a lot of this, I mean, it's still kind of male-dominated, kind of this source of patriarchy that is seen as one of the most grievous insults and so on, right? He didn't like that. He went to the governorate, which is the governor's office and whatnot, trying to speak to somebody there. Nobody speaking to him. They insulted him, kicked him out, and so on. So because of that, he went and bought gasoline, doused himself gasoline, self-immolated. And that was one of the most, I would say, stark examples of that hopelessness that a lot of the Tunisians, youth, and the Middle Easterners in general, of course, could actually relate to. That this is a regime that does not care about humanity and so on, or your dignity and so on. So they basically, that forced him to self-eliminate, and that was the spark and the catalyst to a lot of people started mobilizing in the social media and going into the streets. And going to the streets in a sustained manner, right? Despite the early repression, the early violence that they were met with, right? Because that did not deter him, of course, from continuing on that path until Ben Ali himself was forced to out of office on January 14, 2011, right? And some people said, well, that should be then what emboldened a lot of other youth, a lot of other protesters, I should say, in the Middle East and North Africa to go in the streets. And that's basically what happened. Because right after that January 2011, you start seeing the February, for example, in Morocco, you have the February 20th movement. It was February 20th, 2011, that went in the street and called on for, made major demands, of course, for better economic and political realities for their own population as well. And it was some argued at that time, is this a Twitter revolution? Is there a leaderless movement? It's not mutually exclusive. It can be a Twitter revolution. It is a Twitter revolution. He used Twitter, he used Facebook, he used all of these, but also it was a leaderless movement. And it showed the ingenuity of these individuals and these groups and organizations that joined later on in basically taking advantage of this moment, of course, in mobilizing even greater outside their borders. Because if the Tunisians say we can do it here, then yeah, we can pass the baton to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians can do the same thing, right? So this, this use of social media was a game changer for a lot of the Middle Easterner. However, Tunisia, and again, it goes back to what was said probably in this discussion, there is what I fear a democratic breakdown, right? Largely because the government crisis in July 2021, so it's more recent, right, with the advent of the President Kais Saied. President Kais Saied, of course, has since taken the reign of power in Tunisia, has rolled back a lot of the gains that were made in Tunisia early on. For example, he suspended the parliament. He had new elections by which they passed laws that would actually give more power to the executive branch, to the president vis-a-vis the prime minister. So in a sense, and also give him more prerogatives when it comes to the Supreme Court, the court, of course, in Tunisia. So it elevated his status as a president of the republic above other institutions. So in a sense, you have that whole, what we call horizontal accountability, that you have, checks and balances that we have here. It's largely unbalanced now in favoring the president. And that's why more and more the commentators, and I think some of them scholars say, Tunisia is no longer on that path of democracy anymore, because it really has, suffocated that experience. It was no longer that ray of hope. How much time do I have left? Just want to make sure that I'm not going. I want to allow for some time for a discussion.
We have about another, I would say 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. So I can talk about the example of Morocco as well, because I want to talk about example of how these also influenced other parts. So we talked about Republican systems here, Egypt and Tunisia, right? But early on in my discussion, I also mentioned that the monarchical system did a little bit better in terms of the outcome. In that there was no change, I would say, in the regime. There's no change in the leadership, right? Whereas in Tunisia and Egypt, you had that change. Although, of course, I mean, there's a breakdown, of course, in Egypt as well. I don't talk about it here in detail. In 2013, there was a coup, and then the elected president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, was jailed by the military and so on, and the military took over. And then, of course, they had elections, but the elections are not free, fair, competitive elections. So you have a breakdown, of course, as well in Egypt, right? In Morocco, as a monarchical example, right, you have a different path, less violent, less repressive, and I would say more cosmetic and more institutional, right? That doesn't mean that the Moroccan state is not capable of repressing, right? They are, right? It just, they learned from the Republican systems that is something that would even galvanize the population even more in the streets. So Morocco, for example, is a kingdom, is an Alawite kingdom, not to be, means that the dynasty is called the Alawite and so on. They trace their lineage to the prophet, right? To the great the son-in-law of the prophet, of course, and one who was married and cousin of the prophet as well. Very, very important for them in terms of legitimacy, religious legitimacy, and so on in Morocco as the monarchy. The monarch in Morocco consider themselves as the commander of the faithful because of that lineage that they have to the prophet of Islam. So that comes in later on, of course, because that's also what we call political capital that they use in order to legitimize their rule. And then, of course, they were like Tunisia, they were also occupied by the French, French protector of the French colony from 1912 and 1956. By 1956, that's the Declaration of Independence. 1957, of course, that's where the French forces left the kingdom of Morocco, and they established, of course, a monarchy. They call it constitutional monarchy in the Constitution of Morocco, but it's not like the constitutional monarchy in England, in Great Britain or Spain or Sweden, in which the monarch reigns but not rules. The monarchs in the Middle East and North Africa, including Morocco and Jordan, they rule. Not only they reign, so they have specific political powers, and they are, as we say in political science, the only game in town, right? Because they have those veto powers, they have discretionary powers, and so on, right? Since the independence, Morocco had 3 kings: Mohammed V, Hassan II, and of course Mohammed VI is the current president. And the monarchy itself is, presides over this kind of amorphous political system that we call the makhzen, right? Which is made of several institutions of the state, and the monarchy as the arbiter, if you want, reigns supreme over that, right? And it is a because it's an old system, right? So it's entrenched in the political system for centuries. I'll tell you just this on a footnote. The Alawite kingdom, this particular dynasty from which Mohammed VI, the king of Morocco, has been ruling Morocco continuously since 1653, the 17th century. So you have a remarkable longevity, right? So they've entrenched themselves in the, I would say, the DNA, the bone marrow, of course, of the state, of the society in Morocco. They were part of the National Force for Independence. They didn't distance themselves from the national movement for independence against the French. Although the French, in a sense, supported them early on, but they know that their future lies with the people. So initially, and that's one of the first things that they did, of course, that was saving grace for the monarchy, is that they allied themselves with the National Front for Independence, independence from the French. And then, of course, we said the current president king of Morocco is Mohammed VI since 1999. That's when his father died. Their uprisings, the Moroccan spring, started in 2011, and that started on February 20th, 2011. As I said, the example of Tunisia, right, has empowered and emboldened others in the rest of the Middle East and North Africa to take note, and of course heed that call for mobilization and protest, of course. So there was and it happened on February 20th. So not too long after the deposition of Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, of course, of Tunisia. The February 20th movement, of course, was made of a coalition of youth groups, labor unions, human rights, or it was a menu, if you want, a panacea, if you want, of different of groups, right? No Islamists, as well, as I said, because the Islamists themselves did not take part initially, speaking. And then, of course, the Islamists later on, and these are Islamists that are peaceful, of course, that they are believe in political change through the ballot boxes and so on and so forth, right? It's called the Party of Justice and Development. Later on would join the movement, but not in protesting in the streets. They never went in the streets because they didn't want to, in a sense, the protesters also did not allow them that because they didn't want their protests to be labeled as religious or Islamists, right? Because that could turn off certain individuals from going to going in the streets, and it would give more of a legitimate call for the state to repress them, right? Using the example of Egypt, for example, or Algeria, right? In the 1990s, there's still that memory of the civil war between the government and the radical Islamists in Algeria, and of course, Algeria, as you saw the map, is the next door neighbor to Morocco. So that was what was going on, of course. They were relatively small but peaceful. This is some of the pictures that I took as well. This is part of, they were always peaceful, I would say. In Morocco, they were not repressed, as I said, as in Tunisia, because, personally, I went in some of these protests as an observer, and you see actually the police was, in a sense, clearing the streets and clearing the roads for the protesters to march. And I think that's because they've learned from the Republican system. So initially speaking, the government, the regime had an intention of having these to be orderly, peaceful, and so on and so forth, and that the government and the forces of order did not intervene. So there was a difference in strategy, I would say. The monarchy did not stop at that, right? What they did, of course, and I'll go a little bit faster on this because I want to allow for some Q&A. The monarchy, of course, had also a different strategy by espousing certain institutional changes, right? So to the call of the protesters for eradication of despotism and corruption, the monarchy later on would say, okay, well, we'll change the constitution, right? And we'll have a commission that would look at the constitution and have a revision of it, right? And they did that. Now, the commission is what we call a blue ribbon commission. It's a palace commission that did that, right? And that commission, of course, came up with a constitution that helped change the constitution enough for the protesters to feel that there is change, but those changes really fall short of changing anything about the composition of the political system itself, without the powers were still within the monarchy itself, right? Even the monarch himself came on early on in his speech in March, so that's March 2011, just a couple of weeks after the February 20th movement, and basically pledged comprehensive constitutional reforms. He called himself a citizen king, which is very different language. So again, just at least discursively, they managed to change certain things about the way the political system spoke to the population, and that's something that they wanted to also take advantage of, right, as they are negotiating, of course, with people in the streets as well. And then adopted by 99% or 98%, and I'll let you guess, of course, I mean, if it passed by 98%, how transparent, these votes were. But the new constitution was approved, of course, in June 2011, by 98% of the voters, I would say. So now it takes me to what happened to the Arab Spring, and I say it's fading optimism, right? That's why I call it Arab uprisings, because the spring ended up to be a fall or a winter and so on and so forth. We talk about Syria. We don't know how Syria, we don't have time to talk about Syria. Disastrous civil war provided, of course, a safe haven for radical militia groups, of course, to fester in there, like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and so on and so forth. Became a great battleground for great power politics between Russia, the United States, and Turkey. Egypt, a setback, of course. They went back to authoritarianism after the military coup of 2013. There is a general crackdown on individual freedoms that continues to this day. Libya, it's disintegrated, of course, into militias, into two. In Libya, we have two governments, one in the east and one in the west, one in Tripoli, the old capital, and one in Benghazi, right? But then of course, we had stability in Tunisia for a period of time. So because I talked about 2021, but before then, right, you have this monarchical advantage or exception, right, in which you have this mixture of tradition that the monarchs used. For example, I'm the king would claim, I'm the commander of the faithful, and so on and so forth. It grants him certain legitimacy, not like a president who's put in there through autocratic means, right? They also knew to use less repression and more discursive changes, I would say, more cosmetic changes, institutional, and that kind of sustained them. Tunisia, the only Republican one that actually initially until 2021 sustained more kind of a stability, right, is because they have a compromise between the secular forces and the secularists of Al-Nahda. From the very beginning, Al-Nahda Islamists know that if they want to win over the Tunisians, then they have to espouse more of a democratic civil constitution. And that's what they passed in Tunisia in 2012, right? And they had this caretaker government took care of the caretaker, right? Being repetitive, that basically controlled the government on an interim basis until legislative elections that saw the Nahda Islamist party come to power. And then when the Nahda had lost elections later on, they didn't say, oh, we changed the system, which was a very good indicator of the stability and, of course, that path towards democratization, initially speaking, because a lot of people feared that Islamists would say, you know what, no, we don't like this, we're going to stay in power. And what happened, they didn't do that. They actually got out of power and engaged in a peaceful transfer of power to the next government, right? And then, of course, after that, we had the elections of Kais Saied, and that's what changed the trajectory today for Tunisia, because it would happen that actually it's not the Islamist, but it's the secularist, of course, a secularist president who is now setting Tunisia back in terms of democratic gain, something that you saw as well, part of your documents here, 10 years after the Arab Spring. This is before 2022, I would say, and the suspension of the parliament in Tunisia. So I think Tunisia will be actually declining, today. But democracy has not, fared any better. I mean, again, this is until 2019 or so. So Tunisia still looks high, but I would actually put the graph down now for Tunisia. Tunisia is declining in terms of democracy, as it is the case for the other countries. Freedom of the press is the same as well. There is tremendous repression of the press. By 2019, and actually it's more right now, 26 journalists were imprisoned in Egypt. These are prisoners of conscience. And of course, economically speaking, you still have some of the same problems that brought about the Arab uprising, which is the youth unemployment. You still have a lot of anxious youth not having an opportunity to be part and parcel of the economy itself. Unemployment among the ages of 15 to 24, in some cases, is above 40 in Libya. All of these, of course, above 10% and so on and so forth. And that's what I have. So if you have any questions, I'd like to take the questions. And sorry if I was going a little bit fast, but I wanted to give you a little bit of time and stay within the 40 minutes. But I know I've covered a lot of area.
So, Professor, we have a lot of questions.
All right. Shoot them. I'm
right.
here. Let me just get some water.
Wonderful. Folks, if you don't mind, I'm going to start reading some of your questions. If I miss some of them, feel free to also unmute. We have a lot of incredible questions. So one of the first questions that we have came from Adrian was, we were wondering, in your opinion, if a leaderless mass movement is unlikely or likely to be more successful or succeed. Maybe you could share your thoughts on that.
Well, leaderless movements, of course, they show that they can be successful initially in mobilizing, right? But the problem is that they need also the support, right? And that support has to come from not just from the population, but from the other opposition forces. What happened in these countries, a lot of these opposition forces became self-centered, I would say, and start looking out to take advantage of the power vacuum, whatever that power vacuum would be. So what happened is that most of these regimes, the protests, started, jubilant, right? They toppled these regimes and so on and so forth. But then the regime proved to be, through co-optation, confinement, through repression, boundary setting, and so on, they proved to be more cunning, right, in dealing with these protesters, right? So you can be leaderless all you want and whatnot, right? But if you don't have the support that is coming from certain entities, from certain elite itself, these would not work. Because if you look at those revolutions that you happened in China or France or whatever revolutions you had, you have to have splits within the regimes themselves. Okay, and those the splits simply did not happen in a lot of these regimes. So leaderless movement is good for mobilization, but you need more than that in order to actually have complete regime change. I'm not talking about leadership change. Regime change means a whole political order would change. You will have the military in Egypt not ruling anymore. Because, give you an example, one fifth of the economy of Egypt is owned by the military itself. The military is not going to give up that advantage, right? So they did what they did in order to placate the angst in the streets. And then they reverted, of course, to the old ways, of course, of manipulation and autocratic rule.
I love that question because I think it's a question to ask young people, right now. What does it mean to want change and exact change? And then what does it mean? Do we need leaders? Do we need someone with organizational skills and a base?
Mm-hmm.
One of the other questions that we have for you, Professor, is that in our history books, the word Berber still shows up. So we're wondering if you could help us to understand why that's not appropriate, and so that we can also share this information with our students and update their understanding.
Yes, that's something that should be struck out from those books, because Berber is all pejorative word that goes back to the times of the Romans. The Romans, when they invaded North Africa, and they found, of course, the North Africans at that time, the Amazigh people, which means the free people, right, in Amazigh language. Everybody, of course, who was not Roman and whatnot was considered to be barbarian, hence the word Berber, right? So it's a pejorative, word. There is an active, very vibrant Amazigh movement that is calling for, cultural emancipation. In a lot of these countries, of course, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, they have probably the largest population. Morocco has the largest population of Amazigh people. Amazigh, it's a different ethnicity. They're not Arab. They have different language, and they have become, of course, throughout the years and whatnot, part and parcel of the society itself. But they have not been always integrated. Right. So, and that changed. One of the things that came out of the Constitution of 2011 in Morocco is that Morocco would, they called for the recognition of the Amazigh language as one of the languages of Morocco, and the Hassani language, which is a Sahrawi, language. And that was seen as a measure of success, and it should be, of course, for Amazigh culture itself, right? But the Amazigh are fiercely independent in terms of their own, as they should, in their identity, in their cultural heritage, and so on. And they loathe the word, Amazigh. So the Amazigh, of course, is what we would call them, and we wouldn't call them Berber. Right.
Thank you so much. I know we have a whole bunch of other questions.
Yeah.
I'm catching up. One of the questions that we had was, were the riots in France around the same time connected to unemployment of Northern African immigrants?
Well, I think it was a difference. I think because those have more to do with their French experience, I would say. And it's not just North Africans, there's also West Africans that felt that they were alienated by this, what was called the militant secularism of the French state. And this kind of intention, of course, which is forced intention to assimilate everybody, right, in France. So they might have been, positively influenced by what was going on south of the Mediterranean, but they had more to do, because France is not an autocratic, corrupt state, no. But in terms of economic deprivation, a lot of the let's say, white French, I would say, right? So that would be North African second, third generations, and West African second, third generations felt grieved and alienated from the French experience itself. And there was actually a systematic, kind of discrimination against them in workplace, in school, for Muslims, of course, the right to wear the hijab, the veil or not, and so on. So those, I think, was had more to do with the French intolerance form or intolerant form of secularism, what they call laïcité, as they call it in France, than I would say with the Middle East itself, right? Although, of course, I mean, I'm sure they were aware of what's going on, in these countries, and they had contacts with their own families in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, and so on, about what was going on in their countries as well. But they are ongoing. I mean, we see those protests, on and off in France, even, today with Gilets jaunes, those yellow vests and so on, that still continue to protest all sorts of economic the deprivation, I would say, more than political deprivation that they see in France. So that's a little bit different than what was going on in the Arab Middle East, or I would say the MENA, I shouldn't say the Arab, in the MENA region.
Could you also tell us a little bit more about the term you use called predatory capitalism?
Yeah, well, so this is a form of capitalism, of course, that you find in those countries that espouse certain aspect of free market economics, right? So they will have, certain what you would associate with supply and demand, non-interventionism by the state, but with a caveat that the state actually intervenes and actually directs, if you want, the general decisions that actually guide the economy itself, not just the government itself, but also these international institutions, financial institutions that have tremendous control over the economic future of a lot of these countries, something that we didn't even talk about. I'm talking about the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, because they have these conditionalities. They want people to open up economically speaking and politically in exchange for loans and so on. But a lot of times those decisions, economically speaking, don't make sense for these countries. For example, when they went to Morocco and Jordan and whatnot a few years ago and said, you need to lift subsidies on major commodities like flour, like wheat, like oil and sugar. Those commodities went up. People could not afford them anywhere. Where did people go? They went in the streets. So the government said, hey, the people are going to topple me in the streets. I cannot make these decisions. This decision, economically speaking, may be good for the international, for these economic systems that are Western oriented and controlled, but it doesn't make sense domestically speaking for me. So what happens instead of that, they say, okay, we're going to open up a little bit economic. We're going to allow some foreign investments, right? We're going to allow some measures of free market economics. But then who is the elite? Who is the class that is benefiting from all of this? It's the ruling class. It doesn't there's no trickle down economics, of course, in the Middle East, because it is controlled by not just the few, those that are part of the regime or affiliated with the regime. In Morocco, one of the richest people in the world, Morocco is the king. The king has actually a conglomerate, a holding company that controls assets in different services of the economy, literally. So he has his own, same thing, of course, comes to Saudi Arabia. You have a Saudi sovereign fund, Qatar sovereign fund, Jordan, same thing, right? So that's what we call predatory, because it does not allow for competition. It does not allow for transparency, and is controlled by a few, right? That are preying, if you want, on that economy itself. Syria is the same thing. I mean, it's the same story in all of these countries.
Thank you so much for that. One of the other big questions that we had goes to, and I'm really bad with names, so I'm not gonna mess up the name of the gentleman who self-immolated. We were wondering if he tried through social media or other means to bring attention to himself before, deciding to take that fatal decision. Do you know?
To take the fatal decision, you got cut off in the end.
Of self-immolation.
Well, and it was not one. There were several, by the way, after that. And even before that, actually, we could trace some of these cases. But that was probably one that had more attention. I think the bloggers and social media and so on and so forth, they put in it, and they kind of shed the light on it because it was very extreme, right? And because they reached an inflection point at that time. At that time, youth unemployment and so on, economic deprivation may have reached, unprecedented levels in Tunisia, right? And it became a question of dignity, of course, individual dignity, humanity and whatnot. Because when I was texting these individuals in Tunisia, they were saying, I could be next. I mean, so they're not allowing us in the job. This is predatory capitalism. Nothing is trickling down to us. We have bleak prospects, economic prospects and whatnot. We can't voice our opinions to them because you're repressed politically, right? So what do? I'd rather die. That's what was told me. I'm just saying this in all confidence, right? There were others after that, self-elimination in different countries in the Middle East, in Egypt, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, and all of those. So there's a lot of those cases, of course, that happened, try to galvanize, became almost a symbol. And as I said, a tragic symbol, of course, to galvanize individuals to go in the streets and protest. I mean, at that time, there was this kind of euphoria about, the Middle East. And that tsunami, of course, of the Arab uprising that was going on at that time. So it was not one self-immolation, but Mohammed Bouazizi's elimination was the one that was really the catalyst, of course, in starting all of this, right? And of course, I think because also the way the government handled it, the Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali tried to, I think he was going to the hospital to check on Mohammed Bouazizi and whatnot, and he wasn't seen too sympathetic or empathetic to Mohammed Bouazizi and whatnot. He was seen kind of like a stage photo op that made it even worse for the Tunisians. And I think that's what did the regime. Ultimately, of course, because the military also would split from the Tunisian government. That's why I said to your question before that you'll have to have some split within the elite. The military in Tunisia just decided not to go and repress people in the streets anymore. They didn't want to take part. And they basically forced him to leave. They take the side of the population in this case.
We have lots of other questions, folks, so I apologize if I don't get to all of them. One of the questions that we have here is, what role did the pandemic play in enabling government power by Said? What was that, Said? How did the pandemic play a role in part of what is?
Well, I think the pandemic played a huge role in all of these countries, because it showed the limitations of the state to their own populations and their own people. In Tunisia, they had a really tough time with the pandemic, and I'm not just because of Morocco had a better time. They did well with rolling out the vaccines, with all of those measures, of course, for keeping people safe and so on. Tunisia did not. Tunisia you could see that it was still a young state after 2011, right? The change in the leadership. And they really managed to anger a lot of the population. The population felt that they were not taken care of by the state, that the social contract that you have your own state has fallen. Social contract, you keep me safe, you keep the order and so on. And then, of course, in exchange for my support. And that fell miserably in the 2020, 2021. And he gave an opportunity to Qais Said, of course, in the elections, because he blamed that, of course, on the Nida Tunis, which was the coalition that was ruling Tunisia at that time. And he presented himself, and of course, by that time, the Tunisians were done with the Islamists as well. So he became, of course, the only, in a sense, option and alternative, right? And promising to do better when it comes to, healthcare, when it comes to, of course, to the economy and so on. And he gave him carte blanche, right, by the population. I mean, there is a division among the Tunisians today, how they, how to perceive the state. Of course, there are those that don't like all of these measures that are rolling out democratic gains, but some of them say, you know what, we'll give them excuse, because you have to have these democratic, rollbacks in order to actually stabilize the state. Tunisia is in a really dire state, economically speaking, and politically. I mean, to the point that, not too long ago, I was at this, talk with the Carnegie, and there was actually under the Secretary of State for North Africa, and he basically was relaying the position of the United States government that they are really worried about Tunisia, eventual collapse and so on and so forth, because they're still not from under, of course, that. The yoke of years and years of political and economic mismanagement, right? And now the economy itself is faltering. And I think the pandemic even made it worse, for them, right?
Yes, thank you. Folks, we have tons of questions in the chat, and I am starting to cough. So I'm going to ask Vanessa. I know, Vanessa, you had a question, and Noet, you had a question, so if you guys want to throw out your two as the last two questions, please feel free to do so while I mute myself.
Thank you. We'll get, I'll pull out two other questions here. One,
Okay.
what is the current status of democracy in the MENA region? Will there be another Arab Spring, or is it retreating on democracy as it seems to be happening in other parts of the world, including the US? That's a huge question.
Yeah, and I put it in my lectures, there's fading optimism, I would say. It's not good because when you look at and I hesitate, because, we don't like to kind of do prognostications, of course, because we're really bad at predicting the future as political scientists. We just don't do well with that. But looking at the indicators, if you look at the whole Middle East and North Africa, it's just not looking great because you see the trends into more authoritarianism, autocratic means, repression of the press, opposition forces, and so on. All of those, of course, are being are going full-fledged now in the MENA. There's not a single country when I say, okay, well, Sudan, there is like a civil war right now. I can't say one country and say, oh, well, this country is probably showing no state in this case. And I think if anything, they're declining. They're actually reverting back to old autocratic ways. And I think also it has to do with, I think because there is a protest fatigue, I would say, in the populations as well. They've been in the streets for a decade. And I think a lot of them just want, and you hear it's like, we want to go about their lives. If they have to sacrifice some of their freedoms for stability and order, so be it. And I think that's a tragic and dangerous, equation to have, right? Because you cannot, in a sense, what is it, Benjamin Franklin, you can, basically sacrifice your freedoms for safety, in a sense, right? But I wish I could be more optimistic, but I don't see anyone in the Middle East, of course, that is say, oh, we're going to be democratic, they're going to be a change. I think is a return to old ways. And it's as for the prospect of Arab Spring, as I said, predictions are not saying I don't think so. I don't think so for now, right? It seems that the authoritarian regimes have been cunning, have managed so far to weather all of these challenges. There will be protests, right? There could be leadership changes, but what I'll talk about, what we look for is regime change, right? Something that happens when you talk about the French Revolution, right? When you have one system of government and completely change to another, with the elite completely disintegrated. And that's not something that I'd see happening in the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you so much, Professor Dadoui. We really appreciate you joining us today. We really appreciate your talk. And folks, I think we will head to a break. We'll head to a break now, stand up, stretch, get some water, take care of your needs, and we'll meet you back here in 8 minutes.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Best of luck.
Please join us and then sending some love to our professor today. Emojis, thank yous, all of those in the chat. We are so grateful. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye. All right, folks, we'll come back at 11:10. Please stretch. Take care of yourself. Thank you.
And if you could go back to the beginning, thank you. Thank you so much, Amparo. I appreciate it. All right, folks, we are going to go ahead and dive into our model lesson. Today, instead of a lesson, this is a unit. It is an inquiry-driven unit. And the question that this inquiry is designed around is how did everyday people assert their power and agency during the Arab Spring? If you could go ahead and move the slide forward. Thank you. to ground ourselves in the standards and the framework, to take a look at where I see this fitting in. I see this unit fitting in a couple different places in terms of 10th grade world history. One, I think that this can be paired really well with the American Revolution, and can be taught during that first kind of section there of comparing and contrasting different revolutions. The American Revolution has lots of instances of using media, the media of the time, to persuade people and to help rally folks. As we learned, this revolution, this uprising does as well. So I think it could fit in there. It also, I believe, fits in towards the end of our standards when we're looking at changes in globalization and communication. Our framework does not call out this particular time period in history, but it does ask the question, how has globalization affected people, nations, and capital? And so I believe that this would fit in there as well. In terms of Common Core, in this unit, I really want students to be able to pull out some of those speaking and listening skills. And so we'll see that the assessment on the end is focused around that, or is focused around speaking and listening. So some thoughts about where I see this fitting. And go ahead and move that forward. Thank you. Go ahead, Amparo. Thank you. So this is an inquiry design model, and you'll have a time to play around with it, but I want to explain how this is laid out. It is designed around inquiry. The History Geography Project really believes in inquiry as a way of getting students engaged in history. Our framework also calls for us as teachers and as educators to use inquiry as a way in for our students. So it's designed around one overreaching inquiry question and then 4 smaller inquiry questions. Each inquiry question has a formative assessment that's attached to it, and then a series of sources, some of them primary sources, some of them secondary sources, visual, audio, some readings to really help students to be able to answer that question and do that formative task. Each one of these inquiry questions, I believe, would last anyway. Inquiry questions, I believe, would take anywhere between 2 to possibly 4 days for students and for you as a teacher to kind of guide your students through them. It would depend a lot on your class and who is sitting in front of you. Go ahead, Amparo. So let's take a look at this. And again, it is the inquiry that drives the content here. I have this separated into 4 different topics. That first day is looking at power. And what are different ways that power is expressed? How do we understand power as being that question that students are trying to answer? In that section, we are looking at, I'm encouraging you and your students to use the power model that we looked at yesterday. I also have other informations, other types of power models, other different ways of looking at power if you think that that would be better for your students. That second inquiry is about causes, so we can really wrap our students' kind of minds around what sparked that Arab Spring, right? I believe somebody was talking about yesterday, one of the teachers here that's on it was talking about the ingredients that you need for the recipe to make revolution. And so really looking at what those causes were and having students do some writing around that around the causes of the Arab Spring. The third and the fourth days are both looking at one country specifically. That third day looking at Tunisia and how people, everyday people in Tunisia, asserted their power, asserted their agency over their government there. And then that fourth day, looking at Egypt and how people in Egypt took and used power there in that time period. Both of those days have students really looking at that graphic organizer. Go ahead and move ahead. Thank you. So here is just a glimpse. We're not going to look through at every single day. I just wanted to glimpse. We'll glimpse day 1 and we'll glimpse day 3. So here with that inquiry, we can see what that graphic organizer looks like. We've got 2 different models of power, and we've got an activity there, a formative assessment there to help students really start to look at what power structures could be. This activity is borrowed from our colleagues at the History Geography Project in Berkeley, where students are really looking at how is power used in their school. So getting students to think about something that they're super familiar with, but in this lens of power. Go ahead and move forward, Amparo. And we're going to spend some time here on Inquiry Day, on that third inquiry. And I'm going to present a little bit on how I would take students through this. So the big question that we're looking at is, how did people of Tunisia assert their power and agency over their government? We are going to listen to a piece of this rap from the hip hop artist El General, who is a hip hop artist out of Tunisia, who was in real live time writing raps, posting them online, posting them on Facebook, having his friends post them. And these were some of the songs that were disseminated at the time. And so in just a second, we'll listen to.
We have them see each other.
I'm coming, everyone. I'm coming. Screens are getting all confused today.
Oh, good. So as we listen to this, I want you to start really thinking about what kinds of power. Oh, I lost my slides.
I got it.
To really start thinking, what kind of power does the rapper El General assert through this song?
All right, here we go.
هاني اليوم نحكي معاك باسمي واسم الشعب الكل اللي عايش في الاحلام 2011 ما زال فما شكون يموت بالجوع حب يخدم باش يعيش لكن صوته مش مسموع اهبط في الشارع وشوف العباد ولات وحوش شوف الحاكم في المتراك تاك ما على بالوش مادام ما فما حد باش يقول له كلمة لا حتى القانون اللي في الدستور نفخه وشرب ماه كل نهار نسمع قضية ركبوها له بالسيف فرطان حاكم يعرف اللي هو عبد نظيف نشوف في اللحلش تهرب في نسال ما تحاسبين زعما ترضى هالبنتك عارف في كلامي بك العين عارف مدامك هو ما ترضاش الشر لصغارك الور هذا ميساج عباره واحد من صغارك يحكي معاك من فرنسا انا عايشين كل كلاب اش ترى الشعب عايشين الذل وذاقوا من كاس عذاب رئيس البلاد شعب بلادك برشا عباد من البلاد ثلاثه هاكا تشوف اش قاعد صاير في البلاد مآسي باردو ناس ما قادش وين تبات هاني نحكي باسم الشعب اللي ظلموا واللي داسوا بالصريح بلاد شعب بلادك برشا عباد من البلاد ثلاثه هاكا تشوف اش قاعد صاير في البلاد مآسي باردو ناس ما قادش وين تبات هاني نحكي باسم الشعب اللي ظلموا واللي داسوا بالصريح رئيس البلاد قلت لي يحكي من غير خوف انا حكيت لكن عارف اللي نهايتي قال كفوف نشوف في برشا ظلم هذاك علاش اخترت كلام ورطه وصوني برشا عباد اللي نهايتي قال الاحلام
Thank you, Amparo. If you can pause it right there.
عايش في الاوهام وينها حريه
And take us back to the slides. One of the things that I would do if I was presenting this song to students is you can slow it down. I'd probably play it once at full speed and then play it again at a slowed down speed so that we can read the subtitles as they're coming through really quickly. I would want to make sure that they get played as is first so that you can really hear the rhythm and the beat of that song there. If we can head back to the slides, Amparo.
You cannot see my slides?
No, we are.
Come back and try it again.
It's all good.
Life is complicated today. We're just gonna, how about there? We're good?
That's perfect. Thank you. So we'd listen to that song we'd listen to that song as a class. Like I said, we'd have it both on the screen there. On the screen there, we've got a small clip of some of those lyrics. And the question would then be is how is he asserting his power? Looking at all of those different ways that we can see, whether it's agency, solidarity, internalized power, aspirational. with that, we are going to go ahead and send folks to breakout rooms to explore this question. When you're in the breakout rooms, I will go ahead and make sure that you are sent the links to these slides and also that clip or that quote from the song, and to see, we'll have a conversation in pairs 2 by 2 of where you see instances of this person asserting his power.
Vanessa, can you repeat that? People are now coming back.
Yes, thank you. Welcome back, folks. I would love to hear what you all were discussing. Feel free to drop things in the chat. I'd love to hear examples that you all were able to pull of how the rapper El General asserted his power over the Tunisian government through this song, through this video. If you can drop examples in the chat, that would be great. I'd love to kind of hear where you saw these types of powers showing up in this song or showing up in this video. With the video itself, that beginning piece, I think has some really lovely clues of power with, right? Solidarity of this wasn't him posting the song, as you can see with the beginning of that video. This is somebody else posting the song with information about him and what is happening to this rapper real time on the ground at that time period. So we've got an example just right there of that initial kind of phrasing of a lovely example of solidarity with. And Amparo, when you get a second, if we can share the screens again, the slides again. So I'm seeing power within, pointing out our local issues and how to advocate for change. So yeah, he's pointing to really specific things that he is seeing. All kinds of things here. Wondering what happened with the rapper, if he was ever released. He was released. He's still very much alive. He has toured Europe. He has albums. His songs have became big parts of the uprisings, not only in Tunisia, but in Egypt and other places as well. Power over and power with comes to mind as he's speaking directly to the president, demanding for changes. Thank you. I appreciate you all really thinking about these things and sharing your thoughts with us. Instances of solidarity, how it was shared across different platforms. Ideas of aspirational, of like criticizing the government. Thank you. And so we can see here that this is an example of how I would take students through this to be able to use one small piece. I had a difficulty finding good lyrics for this. In the YouTube video, there are also, you can see the lyrics scrolling. There's also lyrics that are posted there. If you open the YouTube link, there are lyrics that are posted there. It lists all of the lyrics. Amparo, if you can share the slides, please.
I'm trying, my dear. It says I need to resume sharing and now it doesn't want to share. I've closed it and opened it. Let's try one more time, folks. I don't know what is going on today. Ah, there we go.
Got it. Perfect. And if you can move.
I like this one.
Yeah.
Would you like me to go on to the next slide?
Yes, please.
Got this. Well, sorry, wonderful video. Gotta stop you. Okay.
And so what we're going to do next is I'm going to give folks some time to go ahead and explore those sources. I'm going to drop this is in the PowerPoint, but I will go ahead and drop the link specifically to the IDM. All of those sources are listed there. We're going to give folks 10 minutes to go ahead and turn your cameras off, explore those sources, take a look at those sources, give some thought as to how you might use these with students, how you might use these in your classroom, and how you can help students arrive at that formative task with these sources.
Vanessa, can you see my crazy screen now?
It says it's loading.
Oh, okay. That's gonna
just leave it there. That's fine right there.
All right.
Just so that we can see it. Thanks so much, folks. We've got, I'll say this last piece and then we'll open it up for questions and for thoughts on how you might use this in your classroom or places where you could see things changed or any questions you might have about how to go through this unit plan. But the last thing that I want to touch base on is we started our conversation today, this morning, at the very beginning, before we even listened to Professor Dadui's talk on this idea of how we make sense of large-scale social political changes, revolutions, uprising while they're happening. I think for our students sometimes, especially when we're looking at world history, it can feel a little bit of like, those are those people over there, that those are those people over there, and this is what's happening. But it could be very interesting as well to pull that back to ourselves with this question here in the United States of us as a country. We have seen in the last, you know, however many chunk of time, right? Even in the last few years, large scale social political changes happening in real time, right? When we look at what was happening on January 6th, when we look at what was happening in the Black Lives Matter movements, how people were responding to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all of the other Black men and women who had been killed by police. We were looking at that in real time. We were seeing that minute by minute. We were seeing that on social media. We were seeing that in the news. And as a country, we were trying to make sense of those things as well. And it could be a nice thing for our students too, to see that as a country here, we are trying to make those things, make sense of those things as well. And how we as a country try to make sense of those things as a way of realizing that big changes happen here as well, and not just in other parts of the world. And I will pause there. We've got about 3-4 minutes for questions, clarifications on how to use the IDM. Obviously, this is just a unit plan, so you would need to go in there and develop individual lessons that would fit into that unit plan. But feel free to put questions in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions. You've got just a few minutes. And I'm happy to take questions or offer some clarification. Stuff coming in about the resources. Yeah, there's some pretty awesome resources out there. There's a lot on the Arab Spring and the different uprisings. There's a lot of information out there about the rapper Ish Nadal. Yeah, I think he was voted one of Time Peoples of the Year at one point there, and still is very much alive, as I said. Well, thank you so much. Then we'll leave it. We'll leave it at that, and I will turn this over to Amparo, and we will begin to wrap up our day.
And I think, Vanessa, if we can kindly switch roles, and if you could share the end of the PowerPoint, I'd greatly appreciate it, because
yes,
my computer is now wanting me to just blow itself up with all sorts of error messages. We have asked the Professor Adrian if he will kindly share his slides. We're waiting to hear. As you know, there were some surveys and other things that had been created. So we just want to double check that it's okay for us to share. So we should be getting a version of those, and we'll update those on your agenda as we receive them. We want to remind you that those of you who attend all 3 sessions and do a final evaluation for us will be receiving the book by our faculty advisor, Professor Kelly Lytle Hernandez, about bad Mexicans and the connections to LA, speaking of local history. And if you can go on to the next slide. We also want to invite you to join our Sources of Justice in Films Teacher Institute, July 14th through 16th. Please follow those links and join us. We love it. And there's one more from the Western Historical Association that I will be sharing with you all tomorrow. An invitation for teachers to join a luncheon with historians. The conference is in LA this year, and they want teachers to come. So, it's an amazing opportunity. And here, please follow us, connect with us, register to receive messages from us in our state office. We're always looking to work with you. We will also ask our professor today, Professor Mohammed, if they are available for questions, and we'll share the update with an email if that's a possibility. Please, please, please fill out our evaluation. Vanessa, if you could go to I think that, yes, let me put that in the chat for all of you.